A piece of paper arrives, 1 page, your name at the top, a date at the bottom, between them, 12 months of your life, already scheduled, already owned, by a government that didn't consult you and doesn't need to. This is how it begins, not with a conversation, not with a recruiter's pitch about purpose and brotherhood and serving something larger than yourself, with a summons. The Voyenkomat, the military registration office, sends the letter, and the letter is not a request. You report, you are processed the way raw material moves through a factory, none quickly, without sentiment, with the assumption that the unit of input is interchangeable and that the system's requirements outrank the individual's preferences in every situation, without exception. Permanently, you are Ryadovoy. Private, the lowest rank in a hierarchy so layered and so old that the weight of it registers before you've been issued your first piece of equipment. Most men who receive this letter serve 12 months and return to their lives. They carry something different in their posture, a different relationship with discomfort, a vocabulary that civilians don't recognize. But they come home. A small number will not in any form that counts. The ones whose physical scores push into the exceptional range, whose psychological evaluations show the specific combination of controlled aggression and operational obedience the assessors are looking for. Those men will hear a word that functions differently from other words in the Russian military. Spetsnaz, special purpose. The designation covers an entire architecture of units. GRU brigades under military intelligence, FSB counterterror teams, naval special operations. The KSSO structured deliberately after Western SOF models, but the original, formed in 1949 when the Cold War was still learning its own shape, was built for a single purpose: deep penetration behind NATO lines, reconnaissance, and sabotage. A war everyone expected and nobody wanted. You are not selected because you understand the history. You are selected because your body tested well. That distinction matters more than it seems. Here is what separates Russian military training from everything you would find in a NATO country. Not the weapons, not the terrain, not even the duration, the philosophy. Western militaries, American, British, German, build training programs on a specific premise. The individual soldier is the asset. A better trained human being is a force multiplier. Investment in the person inside the uniform returns dividends on the battlefield. The institution exists at least partially to develop the individual. The Russian military operates on a different premise entirely. Mass compensates for individual quality. Suffering builds unit cohesion faster than education ever could. The institution does not need you to be exceptional, it needs you to be durable. The distinction sounds minor. It is not. Basic training is shorter than its Western equivalents. It is also harder in the ways that leave the least visible marks and more brutal in the ways that leave the deepest ones. You learn to march. You learn the AK-74, then the AK-12. You learn fieldcraft, patrolling, land navigation, camouflage that functions in actual Russian terrain rather than in controlled training environments. Then the Spetsnaz curriculum begins. The intensity shifts by an order of magnitude. Weapons handling across every platform the brigade operates. Assault rifles, sniper systems, RPGs, grenade launchers, crew-served weapons, fast rope insertion from helicopters, explosives, demolition charges, field improvised devices, breaching techniques for fortified structures. Every operator qualifies on airborne insertion, parachute assault from fixed-wing aircraft, day and night with full combat load, because the doctrine requires it, and the doctrine does not offer exceptions. Hand-to-hand combat. The Russian system developed in the 1920s, drawing from judo, wrestling, and military striking, designed not for competition, but for ending a physical confrontation quickly in a space where there is no room for technique that requires distance. Alpine operations for the Caucasus, combat diving for naval units, long-range surveillance, remaining in hostile territory for 72 hours with minimal water, no food, strict radio silence, and the discipline to record everything without being detected by anyone. Emergency medicine, yes, because behind enemy lines there is no medevac, no field hospital, no resupply chain. The man beside you is the only medical infrastructure available. He may also be wounded. And then there is the training that does not appear in any official curriculum. Dedovshchchina, the hazing system. Senior conscripts brutalizing junior ones, not casually, not occasionally, but systematically as a function of institutional culture that regards extreme physical punishment as a legitimate tool for manufacturing toughness. It is illegal under Russian military law. It is universal across Russian military units. In Spetsnaz, where the culture already prizes endurance above most other qualities, it is severe. It is the shadow curriculum. The one that produces men capable of absorbing things no official program would sanction. Because no official program could survive the record. You carry the evidence in your body. You do not discuss it outside the unit. That silence is also something that was built in you deliberately. Your 12 months end. The voienkomat processes your discharge. The paperwork moves through the system the same way you did, efficiently, without sentiment. And then you are standing on the other side of it holding a choice that the institution frames as freedom and that functions as anything but. On one side, civilian life. If you are from Moscow, there are prospects. If you are from a provincial city in the Urals, from a village in Dagestan, from a town in Siberia, whose name does not appear on maps that people outside Russia consult, the civilian economy offers limited returns for a young man whose primary qualification is that he's survived something most people never will. The civilian world does not pay for that. It does not know what to do with it. On the other side, a contract, 40,000 to 80,000 rubles per month in base pay. Combat deployment bonuses that can double or triple that figure. Stability, a structure that tells you exactly where to be and what to do and removes the particular exhaustion of having to construct those answers yourself. And the identity, the continued identity of belonging to something that carries weight in the specific world you now inhabit. Since 2013, under Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, the Russian military has been systematically shifting toward a professional contract force. GRU Spetsnaz brigades are now composed primarily of kontraktniki, career professionals, rather than conscripts rotating through on 12-month cycles. The structural shift produces units with more cohesion, more specialized capability, higher operational reliability. You sign. You are still Ryadovoy, perhaps now Yefreitor, private first class, one stripe above the floor. The rank has not moved, but the relationship between you and the institution has changed in a way the rank does not reflect. The training deepens. The specializations become precise. Snipers engage stationary targets at 600 meters, moving targets at 500. Demolition specialists learn to construct functional devices from materials available in the hardware stores of any country the brigade might operate in. Reconnaissance specialists learn what patience actually costs, 72 hours in hostile territory, no movement that isn't necessary, watching and recording until the intelligence is precise enough to act on. Your world narrows to the detachment. The men you train alongside are the men you will deploy with. The bond that forms is not built through ceremony or shared belief. It is built through shared difficulty accumulated over years, the kind of difficulty that civilian relationships do not generate and cannot replicate. The institution has made a significant investment in you. What it has not told you is what it intends to collect. You are promoted, mladshi sergeant, junior sergeant, then sergeant. In any NATO military, this is the entry point into something foundational. The NCO Corps, the non-commissioned officer layer that translates command decisions into ground-level execution, that mentors enlisted ranks across careers spanning 2 decades, that accumulates the institutional knowledge no officer rotation can replicate, the American sergeant major, the British warrant officer. These roles exist because the militaries that built them learned at significant cost. That experience concentrated at the enlisted level makes everything above it function better. The Russian military arrived at a different conclusion. The sergeant is a soldier with marginally more training and marginally more formal authority. The career NCO, the figure who has watched officers rotate through and maintain the thread of unit knowledge through every transition, largely does not exist in the Russian system. This is not an oversight in the organizational design, it is the design. Authority concentrates in the officer corps. Enlisted ranks execute. The system is not built for independent judgment below the officer grade. In Spetsnaz, the gap narrows because it has to. Small teams operating autonomously behind enemy lines cannot function if every decision above private level requires an officer present. The mission demands initiative at every rank. As a sergeant in a Spetsnaz detachment, you plan patrol routes. You make decisions about movement, concealment, and engagement in situations where the wrong call ends lives. Your lives specifically. Chechnya wrote this lesson in a currency that cannot be refunded. In the First Chechen War, beginning in 1994, Spetsnaz units entered Grozny alongside conventional forces that were catastrophically unprepared for urban combat against a motivated enemy fighting on terrain they knew completely. The conventional units collapsed. Spetsnaz suffered alongside them, not because Spetsnaz was unprepared for special operations, but because they were not being used for special operations. The Second Chechen War, beginning in 1999, was different. The lessons had been absorbed. Small teams, targeted operations, specific objectives. The units demonstrated precisely what they were capable of when the mission matched the capability. That match is rarer than the doctrine suggests. A system that suppresses initiative below officer grade does not produce sergeants who can think under pressure. It produces sergeants who wait. In Spetsnaz, waiting is how men die. 5 to 8 years in the brigade. The rank of Starshий Sergeant, senior sergeant, the highest enlisted grade before the warrant officer tier. You have deployed. Chechnya, Syria, possibly both. Syria, beginning in 2015, involved Russian Spetsnaz operating alongside Syrian government forces and on specific missions independently. The deployment was smaller than Western reporting suggested. Often dozens of operators at a time, not hundreds. The impact was disproportionate to the numbers because Spetsnaz teams were functioning as precision instruments in an environment where the larger Russian force provided the kinetic weight, target acquisition, fire correction, the ground truth that satellite imagery cannot produce. Because satellite imagery cannot tell you where the commander actually sleeps, what time the guards rotate, which road the convoy uses when the primary route is being watched. Intelligence multiplied by precision munitions. A small number of men shaping outcomes for a much larger force. You have learned, through direct experience, the things that training tells you to expect but cannot simulate, that plans are theoretical constructs. They survive contact with the enemy for exactly as long as the first engagement lasts, and not 1 second longer. That communication fails at the specific moment when communication is most critical. Not before, not after. That the man who was alive beside you 10 seconds ago is no longer alive, and the mission has not paused and will not pause, and the correct operational response is to continue. You are the senior enlisted man in your team now. The younger contractniki look to you the way you once looked to the veterans who trained you, with a combination of respect and careful attention, because the experienced man carries something the rank structure cannot quantify and the promotion board cannot measure. He has survived situations that have not yet happened to them. His judgment about threat and movement and silence is worth more than his rank suggests. Russia produces soldiers who endure orders. The culture does not reward questioning, not publicly, not professionally, not in any way that advances a career or preserves a posting. What happens to the accumulated weight of what has been witnessed and done and permitted goes inward. It does not dissipate. It does not get processed through any institutional mechanism because no institutional mechanism exists for it. The infrastructure for that, the psychological support architecture that Western militaries have built imperfectly but deliberately over decades of research, it is absent. The Russian military regards the need for it as a form of weakness. The weight accumulates the way scar tissue accumulates. Invisible, internal, permanent. You carry it alone. The institution designed it that way. The silence is not a side effect of the culture. It is the culture. In 2008, Russian Defense Minister Anatoly Serdyukov eliminated approximately 140,000 Praporshchik positions across the armed forces. The stated rationale was modernization, streamlining, the removal of an anachronistic rank that added cost without adding proportional value. On paper, the logic was coherent. In practice, it produced gaps in technical expertise and unit-level leadership so severe that Serdyukov's successor, Sergei Shoigu, began quietly rebuilding the Warrant Officer Corps in 2013. The cost of that reversal was not measured in rubles. It was measured in operational capability that degraded silently across 5 years and could not be recovered by simply reinstating the rank. Institutional memory, once discharged, does not return with the paperwork. You are a praporshchik. The rank sits between senior enlisted and junior commissioned officers, a position the Russian military system requires, but has never resolved how to classify, compensate, or fully respect. You are a technical specialist, weapons, communications, demolitions, intelligence. You have been in this specific unit long enough to know things that exist nowhere in any manual, because they emerged from the particular combination of this equipment, this terrain, these men, these operational patterns across years of accumulated experience. You know which radio fails below -20 and what the field workaround is. You know which supply chain delivers the wrong components and how to improvise from what actually arrives. You know the gap between what the doctrine prescribes and what functions when the situation stops resembling the doctrine. When officers rotate, and they rotate because the Russian military moves officers through assignments on schedules designed around career development, rather than unit continuity, you remain. When conscripts cycle through on 12-month increments and contractniki redeploy and return, you remain. You are the constant in a system built around replacement. Your authority within the unit is real. Outside it, you occupy a category the institution needs but never quite legitimized. Not officer, not enlisted, something the system tolerates because removing it proved at measurable cost to be a mistake. The machine needs you to function. It will not tell you that. You earned your commission at the Ryazan Guards Higher Airborne Command Schools, the RVVDKU, a 4 to 5 year program that combines academic military education with physical training among the most demanding in the Russian armed forces. You graduate as lieutenant, 22 or 23 years old. You are assigned to a Spetsnaz brigade and given command of a platoon-sized element within the OSN, 30 to 40 men. Several of them are older than you. A number have combat experience you do not yet possess. One, the Praporshchik, has been in this specific unit longer than you have been in military service. He is watching to see whether you understand that. The doctrine Ryazan taught you is precise. Teams of 8 to 12 operators. Insertion 50 to 500 kilometers behind enemy lines. Identify and neutralize high-value strategic targets, command posts, nuclear storage facilities, communications nodes, airfields, logistics infrastructure. Exfiltrate before the enemy locates you. The entire operational concept rests on speed, concealment, and the enemy's fundamental failure to find a small team operating deep in territory they believe they control. This is the theory. It was built from genuine operational experience by serious men who understood unconventional warfare at a level most military institutions never reach. Here is what Chechnya demonstrated, what Ukraine is demonstrating again at greater scale and higher cost. Spetsnaz is frequently committed to missions that bear no structural relationship to the doctrine. The specialized capability, deep reconnaissance, precision direct action, strategic disruption far behind enemy lines, is not what gets used. What gets used is the unit's high training standard and physical durability, applied to objectives that adequately trained conventional infantry could accomplish, because adequately trained conventional infantry is not available in sufficient quantity at the moment the objective needs to be taken. You are responsible for 35 men whose specialized skills were built for a specific kind of war. The relationship between a young lieutenant and his Praporshchik is either the mechanism that makes the platoon functional or the first evidence that it isn't. If you recognize that the man across from you carries institutional knowledge Ryazan could not provide, and has no structural incentive to share it with an officer who treats rank as sufficient authority, the unit performs. If you do not recognize this, your men will understand the gap before you do. The doctrine says nothing about this. The doctrine assumes the problem has already been solved. Kapitan through Polkovnik, captain to colonel. The officer corps climbs through the grades. The Kapitan commands a company-sized element. The mayor operates on detachment staff or leads a specialized sub-element. The podpolkovnik may command an entire OSN, 500 personnel. The polkovnik commands the brigade, multiple OSN units, support elements, several thousand personnel in total. General officer rank, for those who reach for it, requires leaving the Spetsnaz structure entirely. The path runs through the GRU's intelligence directorate or the broader general staff. Organizations populated primarily by intelligence officers rather than operators. The practical implication, the people making strategic decisions about how Spetsnaz is employed are not in most cases people who have commanded Spetsnaz in the field. The distance between decision and consequence is structural. It is also invisible from inside the system. Since February 2022, that distance has produced measurable results. Spetsnaz brigades deployed to Ukraine were assigned as components of conventional combined arms formations and committed to missions with no relationship to their designed purpose. Deep reconnaissance units held static defensive lines. Precision direct action teams assaulted prepared positions. Operators trained for insertion 500 kilometers behind enemy lines were ordered to take trenches 2 kilometers from a front that hadn't moved in weeks. brigades, elite forces, used as infantry because infantry was needed, and the calculation was made that elite forces could absorb the cost. In September 2022, the Ukrainian counteroffensive near Lyman caught the 3rd Guard Spetsnaz brigade in a defensive action it was not designed for and could not be adequately resourced to sustain. A Pentagon assessment leaked in April of 2023 reported that all but 1 of 5 Spetsnaz brigades had suffered significant losses. One brigade, 125 personnel operationally active out of 900 deployed. 125 out of 900. The polkovnik commanding that brigade occupied the position the Russian officer corps is structured to produce, executing orders within a system that does not permit refusal and does not provide the reinforcement, the strategic coherence, or the operational latitude that effective execution would require. He could not refuse the mission. He could not adequately resource it. He could not explain to the men still standing why specialists had been sent to die doing work their entire career had been designed to make unnecessary. Command at this level in the Russian military is the exercise of authority within constraints that are simultaneously absolute and structurally incoherent. This is not a description of individual failure, it is a description of the architecture. Every decision made at every level below this one, every conscript processed, every contract signed, every sergeant promoted, every praporshchik discharged and rehired, every lieutenant handed a doctrine that the next war will not resemble, converges here. The system does not fail at the top. It fails everywhere consistently by design. The service ends. Or rather, the service determines it no longer requires this version of you and releases you accordingly. You are 35, perhaps 40, a decade or more in Spetsnaz. The Russian military pension system calculates your retirement benefit on years of service and final rank. It is not enough for the life you are leaving. There is no structured reintegration program, no equivalent of the American FIE. Imperfect as that institution is, it exists. It has a budget. It acknowledges that the transition from combat service to civilian life requires active support rather than a discharge document and a handshake. In Russia, the acknowledgement is absent. The support is absent. The document exists. There are veterans organizations. They operate with limited funding and limited influence on the decisions that shape veterans' lives. Your body has accumulated the evidence of what you spent those years doing. Parachute landings on frozen ground, vehicle impacts, years of sustained physical stress at an intensity the civilian body does not encounter. The injuries are not compensated in any meaningful way. The institution that required them has no further administrative interest in them. Some veterans move into private military work. Wagner, before its internal fracture, recruited heavily from former Spetsnaz personnel for operations across Syria, Libya, the Central African Republic, Mali, Mozambique, and Ukraine. The pay exceeded military rates. The legal framework was deliberately constructed to be ambiguous. The Russian state deploys private military companies precisely because they can operate without the political cost of acknowledging official military involvement. The oversight is effectively non-existent. The moral architecture of that work is a question the institution trained you not to ask, because the institution was never designed to value the asking. You were built to execute. The framework for evaluating what you were executing and why, and at what cost to whom, that was never part of the curriculum. Other veterans returned to provincial cities, apartments in Rostov, Krasnoyarsk, towns in the Urals where the heating works intermittently and the walls are thin. The rate of alcoholism and suicide among Russian military veterans is significant. It is also poorly documented because documentation requires acknowledgement, and acknowledgement invites questions about whether the damage is systemic rather than individual, and those questions lead somewhere the state has no interest in going. Some of the men always described as having not come home did come home. You just wouldn't recognize them as the person who left right now, not in a history book, not in an intelligence assessment or a congressional briefing or a documentary about a war that has already been archived and filed. Right now, today, somewhere in Russia, in a city or a provincial town or a village that does not appear on maps that people outside Russia consult, an 18-year-old is opening an envelope. His name is printed at the top. A date is stamped at the bottom. He is physically strong. He grew up in a place where that was the primary currency of survival, that where the body was the asset, and the asset was tested early and often. He has heard of Spetsnaz. He has seen the footage the Russian military publishes with deliberate care, the obstacle courses filmed from angles that maximize spectacle, the martial arts demonstrations, the controlled demolitions, the imagery of men who appear to belong to a different category of human capability than the one he currently occupies. The footage bears approximately the same relationship to what he is being selected for as a recruitment poster bears to the thing it is recruiting for. The gap between the image and the reality is not incidental. It is the mechanism. He does not know what Dedovshchina actually produces in the men who survive it. He does not know about the Conscript pipeline, or what a 72-hour surveillance operation costs physiologically, or what it costs in other ways that the institution does not measure and does not acknowledge. He does not know that the doctrine he will train on was designed for a war against NATO that was never fought, and that the war he may actually be sent to fight will require him to perform tasks that contradict every specialized skill that doctrine is built around. He does not know that a brigade was reduced from 900 to 125. He does not know what the praporshchik who will train him had to watch the institution eliminate and then quietly rebuild at a cost measured in operational failures rather than budget lines. He does not know what the men who came before him are doing now, in the apartments, in the private military convoys, in the silence that accumulates where psychological support was never built. He knows the word Spetsnaz. In his world, it operates the way Marine operates in America, the way SAS operates in Britain, not as a job description, as an identity, a declaration about what category of person you are. Above the undifferentiated mass, shaped by something most people cannot access, and most people will never be asked to survive. He reports to the voyenkomat. He is processed. He is assigned. The system does not need him to understand what he is entering. It needs him not to. His ignorance is not a gap in the intake process. It is a structural requirement. A machine that depends on willing inputs cannot afford for those inputs to have full information. The willingness and the information cannot coexist, so the information is withheld, and the willingness is cultivated, and the cycle moves forward exactly as it was designed to move. Somewhere in Russia, an 18-year-old is opening an envelope. The cycle begins.